This learning module is the first of 3 that will address keeping track of time. I'm going to start at what I like to call the macro level and then work down to the micro level. So today we're going to be looking at large swaths of time, and by the time we finish up with the third learning module, we'll be looking at smaller bits of time like hours of the day. So today's topic is eras and periodization in East Asia. And the first thing that I'd like to point out is that the particular historical experiences of each of the East Asian nations, particularly China, Japan, Korea, have produced distinctive ways of calculating the passage of time, of calculating the passage of historical periods in each one. In order for us to understand the Japanese system, we have to start with China, which so often happens. We've seen that in other learning modules. So we'll start with a little bit of Chinese history. From early times, Chinese political theorists assumed that the world, or all under heaven, tianxia, is how those two characters are pronounced, tenka in Japanese, should be ruled by a single sovereign. And in the case of China, that's the emperor. Although there were definite periods in Chinese history during which the territory of China was divided between rival states, most notably between the 3rd century BC and between AD 220 and 589, traditional historians developed the practice of identifying the legitimate ruler of each period. This allowed them to construct an unbroken line of rulers from earliest antiquity until the early 20th century. In other words, there's a line at any point in the history of the dynasties. There is a particular ruler over the land. But each one of those dynasties, as we move through these maps, you'll see a change in borders. Each one of these dynasties is discrete in Chinese history, which you might sort of take for granted, but I need to point this out because there's sort of a leap in logic between how the Chinese handle things and how the Japanese handle things. So we see that in the case of China, there were a good number of dynasties over the centuries, and each one of these was considered the legitimate dynasty of that period. Now, I've simplified things rather horribly, so I apologize to my Sinology friends, because certainly there are murky points in Chinese history about who's in charge and which dynasty is official, but you get the general idea. Okay, what about the case of Japan? The Japanese system, calendar system or dating system, dating as in not going out with your friends, but rather figuring out the date of any particular time, this system was heavily influenced by that Chinese system that I just described, but it differed from it in one really important way. This is a key point you need to get. So if you miss it, rewind the video and look at it again. In the case of Japan, there has only been one so-called dynasty throughout recorded Japanese history. So whereas in China, with each change of dynasty, essentially think of it as a change of the ruling family. It isn't always necessary like that, but it's easy to think of it that way. In the Japanese case, there isn't a flip from one dynasty to the next. There's no concept in the Japanese context for what the Chinese call the mandate of heaven. So in the Chinese world, if a ruler became a despot and somehow unfit to rule, then the heavens would naturally see to it that that dynasty would fall and a new one would take its place, and that's called the mandate of heaven. But the Japanese didn't adopt that concept. In the Japanese context, there's only one, if you want to call it a dynasty, you can, although we don't use that term in Japanology. There's really only one dynasty. And the result is that references to the dynasty are really chronologically meaningless in the Japanese historical context. However, the succession of emperors is not. So the Japanese don't adopt this concept of all under heaven, or they the mandate of heaven, but they do adopt the Chinese recognition of the succession of emperors and how that is integrated into the calendar. I'll be explaining more about that in subsequent slides. So in the context of Japan, well, let me start with China. In China, each emperor, beginning with the Han Dynasty, each emperor would give the period of their reign an auspicious name. Okay, it's not the same name as the emperor, it's an auspicious name. And that auspicious name is known in Chinese as a Nianhao. Okay? The Japanese, I liked this system. They saw this system being used in China, they liked it. And the earliest official use of this concept of a reign title, which in Japanese is not Nianhao, obviously, but it's Nengo, and you can see the kanji there. Reign titles in Japan began in 645 AD during the reign of Emperor Kotoku. So it's relatively early in Japanese history. And before I move on to the next slide, I want to make another important point. In my experience with students, particularly students who are kind of kanji savvy, they have a really hard time with that word nengo because they see the go and they think number, they think bango, right? And they see the nen, of course they're thinking year. And so they instinctively think that a nengo has to be a number, but it isn't, as you'll see. A nengo is a name. Please remember that. Okay, let's move on. What are these reign titles and how do they work in Japan? As did the Chinese, and I won't go down that road right now. We don't need to explore Chinese history to understand this. Japanese emperors after the 6th century, they adopt these reign titles, these nengo, and they give these auspicious names to the periods of their reign. And I will be showing you examples of this, but I need to sort of front load the information first. As in China also, Japanese emperors could, not necessarily did, but could have a number of nengo during one reign. So you could have one emperor on the throne, but underneath that emperor, you could have 1, 2, 3, 4, I think the greatest number is 7 or 8 nengo underneath that particular emperor. Okay? And keep remembering, a nengo is not a number, it's an auspicious name. It wasn't until the Meiji Restoration in 1868 that the Japanese emperors then were limited to 1 nengo per reign. And before I try and put this all together, I've got one more slide for you. Let's take a look at this. Keep in mind that the use of reign titles follows Chinese practice, simply numbering the passing years. So if you were using the reign title to give the date of a particular year, you would begin a nengo, a chunk of nengo, if you will. If a nengo lasts for 5 years or something like that, you may begin it with gannen or ichi, the original year, and then simply number each subsequent year 2, 3, 4. And I'll show you an example of this in just a moment. Admittedly, some reigns, some nengo are more important than others. Many of them are kind of lost in history. Even native speakers will hear the name and think, oh, I don't know when that is. I got to go look in my reference text, right? But others, because important things happen during them, we're a little more familiar with them. Being a scholar of literature, one of the nengo that is true, near and dear to me is the Genroku period. That was, or Genroku Nengo, that was 1688 to 1704. And that is well known because a lot of important material, literary material and artistic material was produced during that time. It was sort of a heyday of the arts. And so that's why I mentioned it, because it was, it's a name that you might see. People will talk about Genroku art or something like that. And Genroku is a reign title. It's not an emperor's title. Okay, so let me try and make this a visual for you. And what we see on this slide is from the appendix in Nelson. So if you want to see the whole page, not just this little section that I have excerpted for you, you can stop the video, pull out your Nelsons, go look at that appendix. That was one of the things that I advised you to look at for this particular learning module. And on this page, we see, I'm going to give myself a pointer here, or a highlighter. We see here the first emperor, Jimmu. You know, Jimmu is so far back in murky Japanese history. We see his name in the mythologies and whatnot, but frankly, this section, for quite a distance, is all rather murky and unclear. We have these names from various histories, but they're not super reliable. It's not until we get to about here to Suiko, and Suiko has an asterisk because Suiko was an empress, not an emperor. It's not until we get to Suiko that we get a little bit more of solid footing in Japanese history. In any event, as I was mentioning on an earlier slide, beginning with Emperor Kotoku, the Japanese imperial system, imperial family, begins to adopt this Chinese system of Nengo. So for Kotoku, so prior to Kotoku, if we were referring to a date back in this area, this murky land of Japanese history, we might say the third year in the reign of Senka or something like that. Okay. But once we get to the reign of Kotoku, then we start to see these Nengo. So under Kotoku, whose reign began in 645, there were two Nengo. There was the Taika, which may seem familiar to you because of the Taika reforms. You may have heard of those if you studied Japanese history. And then the second Nengo under Kotoku's rule was called Hakuchi, and that began in the year 650. So if we're referring to a date during Kotoku's rule, we might say, for example, that the year 647 is the second year of Taika, or 652 would be the second year of Hakuchi. We don't say it is the seventh year of the rule of Kotoku. So the emperor's name, with this transition to the system of Nengo, then is not used to refer to the date, but rather the Nengo is used. And the other thing I want to point out about the Nengo is that you can have one, you could have two. As I said, we see on this particular screen, there are just a few, one or two. But if we go forward in time, this takes us into the 8th and the 9th century. You see that for some monarchs, for some emperors or empresses, they had even more. So here we have Empress Koken, who had 3 Nengo underneath her reign. And those first two were so close they actually straddle the same year. So what's up with that? How come you'd have some have more, some have less? Well, the reason why one has a Nengo, and the reason why one might change a Nengo and how one might choose a Nengo, remember these are all supposed to be auspicious, is that often it would it would signal a new start. It would signal a change to the people. If some important political or natural event happened that might trigger the imperial family to decide to change the Nengo. In the end, it's kind of it's a beautiful system artistically. However, it's a pain in the butt when you think about it because you have all these different Nengo. And without a chart like what you see here in Nelson's, it's very hard to simply look at a date, unless it's a really famous one, and immediately have a good feel for when that particular Nengo was. Now if we go all the way forward, this is the last page of the reign chart from Nelson's, in my very old Nelson's, and you can tell it's really old because it ends with Showa. It doesn't even have Heisei in it. And we see here at the top of the page the last Tokugawa emperor. And the last Tokugawa emperor had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different Nengo during his reign. Quite a few. It didn't take long to switch over. You look at those dates, 1860, 1861, 1864. It happened pretty often. And once we get into the Meiji period, we see a remarkable change. And that is, first of all, as I said before, necessarily the emperor only has 1 Nengo. But the other thing that you'll notice is that the Nengo is synonymous with the posthumous name of the emperor. So we don't see that here. So Komei, it doesn't have any Nengo named Komei. But in the modern era, in the post-Tokugawa era, Uh, we refer to the emperor from 1868 to 1912 as the Meiji Emperor. And then we refer to those dates as Meiji 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, or what have you. Same thing with Taisho, Showa, Showa. And the current emperor of Japan will be known as the Heisei Emperor posthumously. And of course, Heisei is the Nengo that people are using today when they're referring to dates in Japan. So let me say a little bit more about this system to help you wrap your brain around it. It's important to remember that the reign title system is still in effect in Japan. We touched upon this when we were looking at colophons of Japanese resources. And if you've lived in Japan, you know very well that most dates that you see will be done using, right now, Heisei and not the Western year. So it's not an antiquated aspect of Japan. It's something that's alive and well. But I also want to say that in the modern era, along with those changes that I just described, you should keep this in mind. The Japanese adopted the solar calendar over the lunar calendar in 1872. And so dates after 1872 that you see in written materials will have solar days and months. But they'll have traditional reign titles, and it's really hard in Japanese to see the difference. And if you're reading something in English, it's easy because you'll see month names like January, February, March, and that's distinct from, say, the third lunar month or something. Because in English, when we refer to January, February, March, we're necessarily referring to the solar calendar. But in Japanese, those things all look the same. So it's going to be, you're going to see something like Sangatsu 13 Nichi. How can you tell that that's March 13th or the 13th day of the third lunar month? You can't necessarily. You got to look at the year and then you can make a guess which one it is. We're going to be looking much more closely at the lunar calendar and the solar calendar in subsequent materials. So just hold tight on that, and I'll say more later. All right, there are any number of comparative charts that combine the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean historical calendars so that one can very easily see across borders. In other words, you can look at this chart, and I'll show you an example, and you can know, okay, in this Nengo in China, was this Nengo in Korea, because the Koreans adopted it too, this whole system, which is equal to this Nengo in Japan. You can see why this system becomes really confusing. The best of these sorts of charts include year cycles. Again, we're going to be looking at cycles in a subsequent lesson, so just hold tight on that. And other sorts of handy information. The disadvantage to these charts is that they're inevitably in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. They're not in romanization. I've never seen one in romanization. I think the assumption is that if you are sophisticated enough as a researcher to want to see a chart like this, you'll be sophisticated enough to be able to work with the kanji. So let me show you an example page. I know this is really small on the screen, but I'm going to blow it up in a second. But before that happens, I wanted you to get a feel for the whole page. I kind of randomly chose this page. And what we see here are a number of columns. The first column here that I've highlighted is for China. This one is Korea, and this one is Japan. This chart also uses the complex kanji, not the simplified one. And then there are some other columns that I will point out on the next slide where it's a little bit clearer and in bigger print. Okay, so this is the top part of that column we were just looking at. I'll go over what's here, but you might want to pause the video too just to kind of let it sink into your brain. On the left-hand side on this chart is the Western calendar. So this is this is the year 761. And sorry, this is 761 AD. You know, in the case of Japan, nothing happens before the year 0, nothing of great importance that we know of. So whenever we're looking at Japanese history, you don't have to ask, oh, is it BC or not, right? All right. The next column is the cycle, and we're going to cover that in the next lesson. So let's just skip over that for right now. Here's China again. Now, in the case of China and in the case of Korea, on the far left-hand column here, we see the dynasty, and it appears in parentheses. Korea was messy. Korea in history at this point was divided, so there were two dynasties, you'll see here, right? So that makes things a little complicated. Let's just look at the Chinese example for the moment. So in the Chinese example, we have the dynasty. This is the Tang dynasty. And then outside of parentheses in that same column, we have the emperor or the empress's name. It's cut off on this particular slide, but there are more kanji there. And that's the emperor's name. But you know, the emperor's name isn't important in a way. Same thing over here in Japan. So Japan, we have no dynasty, because of course there is only one dynasty in Japan. So we don't see a dynasty name in parentheses, but we do see the emperor name here. Okay. What's important for us? When I say, oh, you know, the name of the emperor isn't that important. Here's that name of the emperor in China too. What's important is the reign title, is the Nengo. So here on the Chinese chart, we see a Nengo here. We see one here. We see one here. Okay. Don't worry about these numbers in parentheses. That's getting a little too far down in the weeds. But what I do want you to pay attention to are these numbers right here, this 1 and this 1 and this 2. So if we were looking at this date in Chinese history, this right here would be the reign title, and it would be the first year. So the year 762 was the first year of that particular reign title. The year 763 was the first year of this particular reign title. The year 764 was the second year of that particular reign title, and then they switched reign titles again. They got a ton of reign titles in that particular era in China. Let's go over to Japan. We'll see the same thing. So this one, here's the reign title. And on this page, it begins with the 5th year. So if we'd flipped back a page, we'd see the years 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Oh, I forgot to mention the far right-hand column. This is the Koki system that frankly nobody uses anymore. It's kind of a wacky system. It's almost a sort of mythological system based on this idea of the foundation of the Japanese Empire. I've never seen that used in any of the materials that I have run into doing my research, but they tend to put it on these charts anyway. Okay, so you can safely ignore that column. Okay, so this page begins with the 5th year of this Nengo. So if we were writing the date, we wouldn't refer to the emperor. We would refer to the Nengo. And then that emperor changes right here. Okay, and we have a new one whose name has been cut off on this page. But then you see, so this Nengo goes up to year 8, and then the emperor changes, and now we have to start with a new Nengo. Here's the new Nengo, and we start with year 1. The 1.7 refers to the actual date, the month, and the date that that switch begins. So I think that sort of explains what's happening. A lot of students look at this chart and they find it kind of overwhelming. There is good news. There's a chart in your Nelson's. We were just looking at it. And here's that section of Nelson's that refers to or corresponds to what we were just looking at on that chart. This one's a little less daunting because it's not only got the kanji, it's also got the pronunciation of all the Nengo. But this one requires a little work on your part too. So we were looking at the end of Koken's reign and the beginning of Junnin's reign on that previous page. But the previous page broke it down for us year by year. It was really easy. Oh, you know, year 8 of Tempyo Hoji was the last year of that Nengo we could see, and then we went into the next chunk of time. Okay, let me go back one slide here, and you can see that there is some discrepancy between these two resources in terms of whether the emperor or the empress had whether Junnin had a particular Nengo. So there's some problems because there's some discrepancy in the history. But in any event, trying to figure out the particular years using Nelson's requires a little bit of arithmetic on your part, but you can do it. The nice thing about the Nelson's chart is that it has the romanization. And there aren't really that many charts like that I've seen. So let me bring these calendars and these reigns together. So I kept referring to historical documents and dates in historical documents. Let me show you what that would look like. So a typical date in historical documents will give the year of the reign title and the lunar date. Don't confuse that with the solar date, right? So if you see Sangatsu, it's not March. If you see Shichigatsu, it's not July. Okay, it's the third month or it's the seventh month. So in translation, we would write of this date that I have in the center of the slide. We would call that the 13th day of the sixth month of the fifth year of Genroku. So we're kind of reading back, right to left, backwards from what the Japanese date would be. So Genroku is a nengo. It's not the name of an emperor. Genroku is a nengo, and then we have the lunar date. Now, one thing I'll mention now, and then we're going to come back to it, but I want to plant this seed in your brain. As we've seen, the nengo differ between China, Japan, and Korea because each one of those countries has its own sovereign, and each sovereign chooses his or her own nengo. But the lunar calendar was adopted by the Japanese and the Koreans from the Chinese wholesale. So when you see a lunar date, for example, here we have the 13th day of the sixth month, that would be the same in China and the same in Japan. The Nengo name will change, the Nengo year will change, but the lunar day and month will not. And we're going to come back to that when we do lunar calendars, but I just wanted to, like I said, plant that in your brain. All right, so now I want to kind of pull back a little bit from those, from that look at years and talk about larger chunks of time, periods. Understanding how dates are recorded in historical sources, of course, is necessary to establish the basic chronology of events in a given country. But East Asian studies scholars also, as you probably know, divide the histories of those countries into larger periods as part of their effort to interpret their past and to interpret changes that have happened over time. And we call that periodization. Periodization covers large swaths of time. The impact of interpretation on the periodization scheme can be minimal or it can be great. So first, we might consider what are essentially convenience periodizations. In other words, divisions of the past that simply evoke a time frame and perhaps a very vague sense of the atmosphere at that time. So with very broad brushstrokes, I've given you an idea of what that might be in the Japanese context: the classical era, the medieval era, the feudal era. Some people might switch those back and forth, and the modern era. It depends how you interpret feudal. Sort of throwing Tokugawa in there, and I apologize for anybody for whom that just rubs you the wrong way. Like I said, it's a pretty broad brushstroke. References to the imperial rule itself are not really chronologically specific in Japan, and therefore it is common for historians to divide Japanese history into different periods, different eras, depending on some characteristic of the period where the seat of government was, or which family exercised real power over the government. There are a lot of different possibilities. So, for example, in Japan, the Heian period is named for the capital, present-day Kyoto, where the imperial family lived and where the imperial court was located. The Kamakura period is named for the city, Kamakura, where the seat of power was. Not where the imperial family had moved to, but where the seat of power was, because this moves into that medieval period of Japanese history. The Ashikaga period is named for the family that exercised power, and it's also called the Muromachi period because that was the name of the city where the Ashikaga were based. And the Tokugawa period is named for the family, the Tokugawa family, but it's also called the Edo period because that was where the seat of power was. That was the former name of present-day Tokyo, and that's where the Tokugawa family resided for the most part. The traditional succession of periods prior to the 20th century there, then to try and give you a little more detail, is as follows. And again, these are with broad brushstrokes. The Jomon, the Yayoi, the Yamato, the Nara, Heian, Kamakura, Ashikaga. Then some people want to throw in warring states, right at the end of Ashikaga, Tokugawa, Meiji, etc. If you go and look at the appendices of your Nelsons, you'll find this era chart as distinct from the chart of reign titles or Nengo that we were just looking at. And you'll also notice that there's more than one entry, and there's more than one period that appears here that I didn't just give you on that previous slide because I was trying to make it as simple as humanly possible. If you look at the notes for this appendix, you'll see that the various entries, for example, under Ashikaga or Muromachi, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different time frames. Each one refers to a different historical resource. Sometimes they're the same as we see here, and sometimes they differ. All of these resources, they use 5 of them, are recognized as authoritative, and so the people who put Nelsons together didn't want to commit to one or the other, and so they give you a choice, if you will. And other history textbooks will probably do the same thing. And you might ask yourself, well, gee, how can that be? You know, how can there be such a dispute about these periods? Because these periods are named after the fact. Just like in Western history, people who lived during the Dark Ages didn't wake up in the morning and say to themselves, oh man, I hate living in the Dark Ages. And people who lived in the Renaissance didn't wake up and think, wow, Renaissance, cool, man. These are names that were assigned to those periods after the fact by historians. And so the historians look at human events and pick, according to how they feel, certain events that will mark the beginning, the end of one period and the beginning of the next. Sometimes it's a battle, sometimes it's a change of power. And that's why we can end up with such a disparate collection of years for periods. But we still use them. They're convenient, I have to say. You know, when somebody says to me, oh, it was the Kamakura period, that brings all kinds of certain ideas to my head. But I know, even if I don't say it regularly, I know that there wasn't some magical event that happened right in 1185. There was an event, but it wasn't like all the world changed between right before 1185 and after 1185, which is often seen as the beginning of the Kamakura period, as we see here. Okay, but of course there was significant change. 1185 marks the end of the Genpei War, and that was really when the seat of power changed. In any event, we use these periodizations because they're convenient, but we really need to recognize as historians that they are not carved in stone and they are created after the fact. For periods after the Meiji period, scholars use either Western dates or references to the reign titles of the emperors. In the few centuries before 1868, there's some important terminology you might need to know if you're doing research in Japanese studies. Those few centuries before 1868 are called early modern. Okay, usually that's what most scholars refer to them. And the Japanese term for that is kinsei. So if you were doing, for example, a search using WorldCat or using JSTOR or Project Muse, and you were interested in something happening during that time, during the Tokugawa, your search term should either be early modern or kinsei. The period after 1868 is often referred to as the modern period, Gendai, as opposed to early modern. Okay, you see the Japanese term is really quite different. And I really encourage students to use Japanese search terms, even if you say to yourself, but I don't want a huge pile of hits that are coming back to me of Japanese language resources because my language isn't up to using them. It doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is even if you're using a Japanese search term, often the material that will come back to you will be written in English, but the author put the Japanese term in the article or in the book in such a way that your search engine finds it. So these are, Kinsei and Gendai are much more specific in terms of historical focus than just writing modern or early modern. So that's why you want to use the Japanese term when you can. Now, coming back to periodizations, there are some very useful charts that put China, Japan, and Korean periods all in one place so that you can kind of get a bird's eye view, maybe a 10,000-foot view, you could say, of these different periods. But because periodization is real slippery, these charts don't necessarily agree. So on the right, I have a chart that's in English. And this came from a history of Korea, a book on the history of Korea. And then on the left, I have a chart that's in Japanese. And you'll notice that even though they, in theory, cover the same amount of time, that they certainly are not identical. Let's just look at the Japanese side of it. This chart has this Yamato period all the way up to 645. Ignores the kofun, we might expect asuka, right? Those are all missing here. And then it begins with taika. Taika's not here at all. On this chart, we have nara, and then nara is here. Heian, okay, that one I see. But then, whoa, what happens between Heian and Tokugawa? On the left, we've got the Kamakura, and we've got Muromachi, right? And on the right, all they have is Fujiwara. Why is that? Because they're looking, look at the bottom, the dynastic periods. They're not concerned with who was in military control so much as who was ruling the imperial family. And during that time of the Kamakura and the Muromachi, the Fujiwara were, in theory, synonymous with the imperial family. What's curious is then they list civil war and then Tokugawa. Why they do that is kind of mysterious because the Tokugawa weren't the emperors. They were the shogun, but they weren't the emperors. In any event, you can see how these charts illustrate the subjectivity of periodization, but they're still handy. I like it because I can look at the chart and say to myself, okay, what was happening in China during the Kamakura period, or what was happening in Korea during the Kamakura period? And you just kind of slide your eye over and you can see what those comparisons are. So that, in a nutshell, is periodization and Nengo. So in our next learning module, we're going to be taking a look at lunar calendars and solar calendars and how to do those conversions. And also, we're going to be looking at what's known as the sexagenary cycle, which appears on one of these charts that we already looked at today. So you might want to keep that in mind when you open up the next video.